G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas, and let me tell you, there are a few dangerous ideas floating around Europe at the moment as we look towards this weekend's second round runoff elections in France. President Emmanuel Macron has rolled the dice and everyone is waiting with bated breath to see whether or not, as much of the legacy media puts it, France will be governed by a far-right party for the first time since the Vichy regime during World War II. I'll get to more of that in a moment, but this episode is about the only example, really, of a true slide of a democracy into semi-authoritarianism in Europe, inside the European Union. Thanks to a strongman in Hungary who's become something of a poster child for right-wingers all over the world, from Tucker Carlson to Donald Trump. They seem to love Viktor Orban. Orban is in the news again this week because he is Europe's most pro-Russian leader. And Hungary, the country that he's been running for 14 years, has just taken over the rotating European Union presidency. This is something that each country gets for 1 year. It's now Hungary's turn. And the first thing that Orban has done is he's popped up in Kyiv to hold talks with President Volodymyr Zelensky about why Ukraine should stop fighting and should beg Russia for peace, basically. Viktor Orban's foreign minister in Hungary has made at least 5 trips to Russia since the start of the war. NATO has been pretty appalled that Hungary, which is a NATO alliance member and a member of the European Union, would be cozying up to Vladimir Putin and refusing to help Ukraine. Hungary has really become a thorn in the side of the European Union. Diplomats in Brussels hate this situation they find themselves in, where basically if Hungary was as authoritarian as it is now when it was admitted to the European Union, it would never have been admitted to the European Union. But what do you do now that they're in the club? Ditto NATO. This all comes against the backdrop, of course, of a lot of mini-me Orban-style right-wing candidates sweeping the European Union elections from multiple countries across Europe. That's what prompted the French president, Emmanuel Macron, to roll the dice and call a snap parliamentary election in France. That second round takes place this Sunday. And yes, could lead to the first far-right government in France since World War II. Just to be clear, President Macron would not lose power in France. He's there until 2027. They have 5-year terms as president. It's worth saying, at the last presidential election in 2022, Macron only won 58% of the vote, even though he was up against the far-right presidential candidate, Marine Le Pen, rather than running against one of the major party candidates. So, big tidal shifts in public opinion in Europe, and France would be by far the biggest and most important country to be led by a quote-unquote far-right government. So what does far-right mean? This episode is with someone who lives in Budapest and is something of a dissident against Viktor Orban and can get really into the weeds for those of us who are inclined to political wonkery about what has been happening in Hungary. Probably worth just giving you a bit of a backdrop about Hungary, a refresher course in case you're not an avid student of Hungarian history. You may remember it was part of Austria-Hungary between the 1860s and the end of the First World War. They lost the First World War, so then they ended up on the wrong side of the Second World War as well, along with Italy and Germany. And after that became a vassal state of the Soviet Union. So they had to endure communism right through until the 50s. And then they had a revolution in 1956, which captured the world's attention and was kind of this big beacon of like, will the students and the smaller liberals be able to wrestle power back from the communists? Long story short, not exactly, kind of, maybe a little bit. And then at the end of the Cold War in the late 80s, when the Soviet Union fell apart, Hungary was one of the most successful countries to come out of the Soviet era. I mean, it rapidly modernized, rapidly transformed. You could visit Hungary in the early 2000s, and it was this dynamic country. It joined the European Union, it joined NATO, and its decline in the past decade or so from being a fully fledged liberal democracy, up-and-coming freedom country to being essentially undermined by an authoritarian is a really good case study in what can happen when you sort of take for granted norms that we're all supposed to live by in free societies. What happens when the Federal Reserve is no longer independent, as has happened in Hungary? What happens when the Supreme Court is no longer unbiased, as has happened in Hungary, and perhaps a few other countries that we could point at? What happens when news outlets receive partisan pressure or nudging or influence from government officials and essentially become mouthpieces of the state? What happens when COVID emergency decrees centralize power and then the government doesn't take it away? What happens when governments install loyalist judges who will give them a pass on anything that they want to do? What happens when governments try to constrain opposition parties or hunt down their opponents or make it difficult for opposition parties to raise money and to advertise? Today's guest, Péter Krekó, knows all about this. He's lived through it. He's an academic. He studies it. As I said, this is definitely one for the wonks in the sense that this is specifically about what's been going on in Hungary, but you don't have to sort of step back very far to understand what could happen in France and what indeed could happen anywhere else. Just a note about the French elections and the far right in France, the National Rally, as they're now called, formerly the National Front. I have been frustrated, disappointed by so much of the coverage in the Western media, which is saying things like this would be the first far-right government since Vichy. I wrote this on my Substack notes. You should follow me on Substack notes, should you care to do so, because it provides an opportunity to chat about things in ways that I don't really want to on Twitter, and the character count prevents me from doing in long form on Twitter. And there's, I think there's really something to be said for still being able to communicate with you and hear from you in writing rather than just in sound bites on Instagram Reels and TikTok and so on. So I wrote in my first ever Substack note the following: is anyone else finding it hard to understand the true stakes of the French election? The New York Times says, quote, "For the first time since the Vichy regime, France would be in the hands of the far right." National Public Radio in the United States writes that the election could put, quote, "the far right in French government for the first time since the Vichy regime collaborated with the Nazis in World War II." I wrote, guys, the Vichy government was an authoritarian dictatorship that interned Jews, Romani, and gays in concentration camps. The comparison with the National Rally, that's the French far-right party, which did so well in the first round elections recently and may sweep to power on Sunday. The comparison with the National Rally may have been valid at a stretch 52 years ago when the National Front was founded as a fascistic anti-Semitic movement. But its founder was expelled from the party a decade ago, and it now presents itself as a populist party of national conservatives. What does this party in 2024 have in common with Vichy's 1940 Nazi collaborators, except that sensationalist journalists get a hard-on when they write the words far right? It's an honest question, I wrote. Is the risk that the rally poses to France akin to a French Vladimir Putin, that is an existential threat to democracy, or a French Viktor Orban, that is catastrophic but not existential, or a French Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, that is nasty but manageable? Legacy media outlets, I wrote on my Substack note, seem more committed to arm-waving catastrophization than to describing what specific policies are attracting non-crazy French voters to the rally's platform. Mon Dieu. I will have more to say and more insights to bring about the French far right. Suffice it to say, don't believe, do not trust any outlet that is making comparisons between the National Rally today and the Vichy regime of Nazi collaborators. It's a lot more complicated than that. The strains of right-wing reactionary politics and anti-immigrant sentiment across Europe are much more complicated than simply drawing, analogies at a stretch with World War II. I hope you enjoyed this episode. We recorded this back in February, so we're not talking specifically about this. I was sort of waiting for a moment when Viktor Orban would come up in the news, because I thought this is a moment when you're going to want a real deep dive into one particular country's plight. Professor Péter Krekó lives and works in Budapest. He's an economist and political scientist. He's a researcher at the Centre for European Policy Analysis. And I hope you enjoy this glimpse into how a democratic country can be dismantled into a semi-authoritarian state. Enjoy the one and only Professor Péter Krekó.
So Hungary's experience is fascinating to me, Peter, because although my name is Hungarian for some reason that I don't know, and although I have been to Budapest and loved it, I have no affiliation with the country, except that whenever I'm speaking with friends of mine who are in the European milieu of EU elites, they express grave concern about the fact that there's a European Union member that is becoming a semi-authoritarian regime of a kind that would not have been accepted into the EU had it had the political complexion that it does now. And then on the other hand, when I speak to American conservative friends of mine, they speak about the Hungarian government as this bastion that we should be looking towards of a robust vision of cultural conservatism and common sense in a sea of woke social justice crazies in the Anglo world. What am I to make of those two different perceptions?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I have to tell, I'm a liberal guy, but liberal more, I think, in the European sense, a bit less in the Anglo-Saxon sense, where it's more the synonym of being a lefty. So I'm not a lefty. I'm more, let's say, centrist liberal, but as that, I rather share many of the concerns that the European, pro-democratic forces, including the center-right, don't forget it, European People's Party share, because of the demolition and destruction of the independent institutions in Hungary. And it's Hungary is a small country of only 10 million. So with a very strong government centralization and with taking over some of the institutions, the exercise of power in a small country like that can be way, way more effective than in a big country. And of course, in a more, where regionalism matters more, like in the United States, but also in Germany and elsewhere. So I think that there are really some unhealthy developments, and I honestly do not share the values of the government, especially when it comes to issues like anti-LGBT policies and rhetoric, which sometimes gets pretty nasty. And it's not about, I mean, what you have to know is that there is no such a thing as woke ideology in Hungary, and I'm really not a big fan of woke ideology. But whoever fights with wokeism here in Budapest these days, you're just, fighting with the ghosts, because they are not really there. And also it's a palo-conservative government. On the other hand, I have some good relationship with some of the friends of the government from the Anglo-Saxon world, like Roger.
Sorry to interrupt, but to people who haven't been following, the history of Hungary over the past decade, when you just mentioned the demolition and destruction of independent institutions, what is that? What does that look like? What has happened?
I mean, to tell you a few examples. I mean, Hungary traditionally more followed the German constitutional model that is built on very strong checks and balances, of course, built on the historical experience that if you do not have these checks and balances, that things can go pretty bad, as it happened in Germany in the 20th century. and in the 30s practically. But for example, the Constitutional Court had been one of the most important institutions counterbalancing governmental and mostly, parliamentary decisions.
The Constitutional Court, is what? Is that the equivalent of a Supreme Court or a High Court?
Yes, exactly. Okay. And what has happened with the Constitutional Court, for example, when Orban came to power back to 2010, is that the rights of the Constitutional Court has been narrowed. Some of the rights, the Constitutional Court were stripped off, and it was watered up with loyalists close to the government. Of course, the political game is something similar, I think, that in the United States. And yes, there are many similarities these days between the politics of the United States and Hungary,
how are justices of the Supreme Court, High Court, Constitutional Court appointed? Is that by the Prime Minister or is it by Parliament?
No, it's by the parliament, but given that the Hungarian government has a 2/3 backing in the parliament, it has no problem with selecting practically whoever they want to. The same happened previously with the central bank that has been more independent from the government beforehand. Right now, in an ironic manner, because there are some conflicts between economic policy decision makers on who made the mistakes in the last few years, the central bank is becoming again a bit more independent. But the independence has been reduced. There were the prosecutor's office in Hungary is playing very actively in burying all the corruption cases that were allegedly some members of the government or people close to the government are involved, and because of the fact that the prosecutor's office can block the judicial procedure and can hamper the process to go into the judicial phase, this is a very highly efficient shield for the government. The media authority has also, let's say, turned to be much more loyal to the government, and why the media authority allows pro-governmental media merges.
What is the media authority? That is like a department that controls who can own media licenses and who can run radio stations and television stations?
Yes, exactly. So they on the one hand are responsible for giving licenses to for example, when it comes to the radio stations, but also they can release fines if they think that someone hurts the relevant laws on what can be shown on media and what not. But also what is pretty important is that the media authority, together with the competition authority, are responsible for saying yes or no to media merges. And in Hungary, we could see the biggest, I think the biggest media merge, not necessarily in terms of absolute net value, but in terms of the size. Compared it to the size of the country, the most important media concentration. So it's like Silvio Berlusconi, I think, could have never dreamed of such a media empire. Of course, compared to the size of the country.
And who owns this media empire? What is this media empire?
This media empire is partially state-owned media that have really become pretty propagandistic. And that's, if you take a look at the media landscape in Hungary, this is, if you switch on public television or radio, it is really similar than, let's say, Russia Today or something like that. Or I would say, the other state television, but with zero criticism towards the government. And it's, but it's not the only part of the story, because previously private media were also put in a huge giga conglomerate called KESMA, the Central European Media Foundation, and it's a huge foundation, and it owns more than 500 media outlets, and it's just beyond the beyond the state-owned media empire, which is also pretty big. So about more than 80% of the Hungarian media in terms of ownership and revenues belongs to the government, directly or indirectly.
Right.
And
I mean, but the relevant thing here is about the editorial control of the media, right? Because some countries have very large, government ownership of media outlets, like the United Kingdom, for example, where the BBC is a behemoth, but the BBC is independent, supposedly, from government interference. What has changed in Hungary? And was it ever the case that in Hungary there was a robust, independent, state-owned media like the BBC that was fearless in its criticism of government? And if so, what happened to it?
Yeah, good question. Because of course the situation was never, white. And I think the public media is rarely black or white, in the sense that, of course, all the governments beforehand, to different extent, but use the public media to put there some of the loyal faces. And of course, some editorial control have always worked, and it was never totally independent from politics. And the situation is easy. BBC receives most of its revenues from the subscription fees, practically. We can say more or less directly.
Yes, but that's a mandatory subscription, so it's like a tax.
Yes, it's exactly. But it does not need a political decision. In the case of Hungary, it needs a political decision because the parliament have to approve the budget, in which you have the line for the state media as well. What we could see, though, between, let's say, 2002 and 2010, where it was a social liberal government in Hungary, that, you could feel, I mean, if someone would just come to Hungary, not knowing who is the government there, switch on the TV, let's imagine that he or she speaks perfect Hungarian, then I think, and knows something about politics in another country, I think after an hour or 2 hours, he or she would have figured it out that it's okay. It must be a lefty government in place. But it was still way more subtle. It was way less direct than what we can see now, where the state-owned media have really become a propaganda machine that does not, comply to the basic journalistic standards and ethical rules. When you had, for example, interviews in which the Vox Populi was the cameraman sitting on the other side of the camera, for example, or when you could see fake stories, for example, on Swedish people that are escaping from Sweden and coming to Hungary because they thought that Sweden is a nightmare and so on. So it's really not a we cannot just say that it's biased, but we can also say that it is lacking the minimal ethical and journalistic standards in many cases. And unfortunately, this is something that is quite typical in the pro-governmental media. So it's not only polarized, it's like the minimal media ethos that you have to be, to a certain extent, or to a large extent, credible in the sense that you do not go against the facts. So it's not really happening. And of course, we can say that, again, it's not something as a Hungarian invention. The whole concept of post-truth comes from the Anglo-Saxon word. And in many sense, what the government does in the media and in the public communication and in the public campaigns is an Anglo-Saxon import, but also when it comes to the institutional background of the media, I think it shows more similarity to the Russian situation. I mean, the way how Vladimir Putin centralized the media after the cursed submarine catastrophe in the early days of his presidency, when he could feel that if there is an independent media, then it can hurt my popularity and bring me down. I think something similar happened here. First, the government-friendly oligarchs bought up the media and then turned them into mouthpieces that are parroting the governmental messages. And if you asked about editorial control, there are regular political guidances for the editors, and we know it from leaked audio tapes, and we also know it from people who were working in the public media or the pro-governmental media and left it and become some kind of, let's say, whistleblowers.
That's extraordinary because, I mean, when you say that in the previous centre-left government, you could probably have picked that the state-run media, that the state media was biased towards the left. I do think there's a difference between a sort of ideological bias that sometimes stems from the fact that journalists tend to be left-wing versus a procedural, being procedurally captive to the government that's in power. Like, I think you find that the news in many places is left-wing because of the types of people who choose to work in that industry. But it's a different story when you're literally burying stories or receiving talking points or giving politicians a pass specifically because you're beholden in a partisan way to a particular government. And you mentioned earlier that there were sort of talking points or things that the media either is encouraged to say or is punished for saying. Is that true? How does that work?
I mean, let me give you an example, and that's a very important point. What you raised, that it's I mean, because of course, I'm not a journalist, and it's but I mean, my conviction that there is no such a thing as totally objective media. And honestly, it would be pretty boring. So no one would be interested because, I mean, if you just purely present the facts, how do you select them? What kind of, I mean, where you set you put them into. So it's like, and it shouldn't even be the expectation. But here, I think often the false logic is that there is no such a thing as objective media, which means that you can go totally partisan and should not even trust the facts because there are no facts. And the two things are totally different. And let me tell you two examples about what's often can be seen in the pro-governmental media and even in the so-called public media, which I rather call state media. So we used to call it government-controlled media. So if you, for example, as an editor, talk about the government and the right in Hungary, saying always that we are doing this, we are doing that, and so on. I mean, then it means that you do not even take the minimal effort to try to pretend that you distance yourself to a certain extent from what's happening on the governmental side, and in not necessarily in news, but in evening opinion shows, you always have this kind of characters that are just talking about themselves as part of the government or the governmental side. Second example, when there was the migration crisis in Hungary in 2014, 2015, Hungary was never...
Just to remind people, this is during the Arab Spring, a lot of people coming from Syria and elsewhere in the Middle East into European countries, and Hungary is one of the first countries that you would reach if you were trying to get into the European Union.
Yeah, it was the consequence of the Arab Spring a bit later, and it's mostly the Syrian civil war was the most important reason why many people were fleeing. But of course, the situation was a bit more complex. Russia played quite hard to exacerbate the migration crisis with military intervention and also human smuggling and so on. And it was also successful to a certain extent. What happened is that most of the refugees who wanted to go to Germany or Austria, they had to go through Hungary. And the Hungarian government have pretty early started a very aggressive anti-immigrant, anti-refugee campaign. And again, it's not something as a Hungarian invention. We have these voices in the US. We have these voices in other parts of Europe as well. But there was a circular that were sent to the editors at the public television, and it said that you can never show women and especially children when you show the footages of the refugees. They call them only migrants, and you can never call them refugees. You can only call them migrants. So you have to kill out the empathy from other people towards the migrants, and that's just one example of the many. Or there was another circular that said that you cannot label the populist right parties in Europe far right parties, because it's more and more the alliance that Fidesz fits into. So be careful about how you.
And who is sending these memos, Peter? Is it the Department of Media, or is it the Prime Minister's office? Who's sending these memos to the media companies?
Usually it comes from the media, but as I said, what we know from the operation of the media is that the orders are usually, and the phone calls and so on, are coming from above, from the political level, in many sense. So the Hungarian media,
I'm just trying to think of
strongly politically controlled.
I'm just trying to think of how this would play out in a liberal democracy that was more robust. I mean, if that happened. If that happened in any of the newsrooms that I work in, it would be regarded as so taboo by the editors and the producers at the newsroom that it would almost just encourage them to go in the opposite direction. So were there people who did that, and what would happen to them? How would those people suffer consequences? Because in Australia, there would be no consequence. I mean, you'd probably get promoted for defying the government order.
Yeah, it's a perfect question. I think because it's not always obvious. I mean, there are some stories where journalists have been fired from pro-governmental or state-owned media because they were not following the line. And then as I said, or some of them have become whistleblowers, or at least gave some interviews in the public and told about how strongly the media was controlled and how obvious orders you receive for your editorial work. But also we have to tell that the reason why these institutions can work so efficiently, and the reason why the political occupation of these institutions can work so efficiently, is that people are willing to follow the line and figure out what the line could be. So it's not always just the circulars, but it's also in many cases people who comply to the circulars, but also people who try to figure out what can be in the head of decision makers. So and this is what Timothy Snyder calls, and I think it's a brilliant term that describes well the the subjective side of the increasingly autocratic regimes, the anticipatory obedience. So when you try to figure it out, what could be the rule that you have to follow if you want to be a good comrade, and that's clearly part of the picture, and it's everywhere. So and at that point, of course, we can also tell that if the society works a bit differently, we have to put it into historical context. In the 20th century of Hungary, totalitarian left-wing and right-wing regimes were both in place, but it's like in Hungary, the democracy has very real, genuine democracy has just a very short history. So there are these reflexes in the societies that, okay, you just have to follow the rules and you have to follow the strongman. And I think clearly could play out differently in the United States. Quite interestingly, and let me also raise a point that I found as a research of conspiracy theories and disinformation. What I see is that, in highly polarized environments like the United States, the result when it comes to the public opinion can be quite similar than in an increasingly authoritarian centralized environment like in Hungary. The belief in weird conspiracy theories in Hungary is just on an extremely high level. About more than half of the Fidesz voters think, for example, that there are US biolabs in Ukraine. Therefore, Russia has some kind of justified action of quote unquote self-defense when it attacks Ukraine, or that Ukraine developed nuclear weapons and things like that. And why is it these thoughts are popular? Because they are spread by the public media. But when we can see that in the US, there are the QAnon conspiracy theory, the satanic panic conspiracy theories that my friend Joe Shinsky from the University of Miami have did good research about, but also that conspiracy theories are all over the place, and in Hungary as well. Conspiracy theories on that Orban is just a puppet of Putin, or that he goes regularly to psychiatric treatment because he's a madman. It's just like doctors have to keep him in a normal place, and to keep him in bay when it comes to psychological conditions. So all over this hyperbolic narratives are all over the place, and I think it's increasingly the case in the United States, and in a totally different environment in Hungary as well. It's also the case. And I just want to say that even if I think the editorial practices can be totally different in the US, and I think you might be right that it's like if editors are told what you have to write about and what not, maybe in the US it works more as a counter indicator. But because of the increasing polarization that people are involved emotionally in the informational war, the end result when it comes to the mindset of the voters can be a bit
and certainly it depends on the ethos in the organization, in the journalistic organization. You can look at the behavior of Fox News during the Trump administration and see it functioning almost as a state-run media organization. Exactly. So let's move from the media to other institutions. You mentioned the judiciary. I think it's easier for people in the Anglo-Saxon world to see how you could stack or rig the justice system, because we see the Supreme Court of the United States full of political appointees, and it's obvious that the types of cases that get prosecuted are dependent on who is doing the prosecuting. So if Donald Trump wins re-election and he controls the Department of Justice, they will be going after a whole bunch of different people and not going after a whole bunch of people like him that the current Justice Department is. Is there any particular way that you can explain how that has derailed in Hungary to a greater extent that is worse than what we see elsewhere?
Yes. Very important question. I will be rather brief and have to draw the limits of my expertise. I'm not a legal scholar, so I can talk about the big picture. When it comes to the little nuances, it's better to talk to a constitutional lawyer in Hungary, but it's not just by mistake that one of the most important points of debate right now between the European Commission and the Hungarian government. The European Commission is the, let's say, government of the European Union, the executive branch of the European Union. Even if we cannot directly translate national political democratic institutions to the EU level, but it's something similar. And Hungary, this debate has a huge stake. How much money Hungary gets from the European Union? About 2/3 of the funds that have been frozen because Hungary does not comply with some of the democratic practices that the EU would like it to comply to, 2/3 of them are still frozen. So and we are talking about huge amounts of money that are very relevant on the budgetary level and on the macro level of Hungary. So in the center of the debate is how much the judiciary is independent in Hungary. And because it was noticed, and I think for good reasons in the European Union as well, that through, for example, the early retirement of judges and, a new influx of younger, easier to control, sometimes more lawyers that are more loyal to the government. So there it can make a substantial change in the in how what decisions are made by the judiciary. Also, we can tell that there has been some important judicial reforms that practically separated two branches of the judicial system, and there has been quite a lot of controversy between the two sides. So the politicization have begun.
Wait, what was that reform? Can you explain that? The reform you were just talking about that split the judicial system into two pieces?
That's where I think it's better if you talk about a constitutional lawyer. Really, I
know more than I do.
It might be, but I don't want to say any stupid things. So I mean, what we can tell for sure is that, and it's also based on my experiences. For example, I mean, I was subject of some disinformation campaigns in Hungary where there were some really ridiculous statements made on me. And in some cases, we asked for some press correction. In some other cases, we also, it was a libel case. And
libel,
in like libel, sorry. It's like, 8-10 years ago, you could be rather sure that they were claiming, if someone was claimed in the media that is factually highly incorrect and it's easy to prove that it's incorrect, then the judiciary asks the editorial office of the given media institution that, okay, you have to correct that. In the last cases we had, and they were totally really obvious cases. It's like when it comes to the highest court of the judicial decision making, and this is the Curia that was also set up by this new system. So a third rule of appeal, practically, where usually the most where the politically most sensitive cases go. And what we can often see is that if this case is pretty important, then a Curia body or a board receives it that is usually rather governmental leaning, and its personal composition, you can find just, relatives of governmental members that are on board. And surprisingly, they usually make a decision that, for example, if someone is very close to the governmental side, an important person, then any press correction requests are just turned down. So also there was this part of reform to set up a third level of appeal, and I mean, as a result, the Hungarian judiciary have clearly lost parts of its independence. I would say that it's still rather independent in many sense, and it's important not to see things as black and white. And I think the illiberal regimes like Hungary, the nature of these illiberal regimes is that there are 50 shades of gray. You rarely see black and white. There are shades of gray, but what is also a very important point, and this is something that I mentioned, that the prosecutor's office can block the investigations from going into the judicial phase, and it means that if the chief prosecutor in Hungary is loyal to the government, that he's very loyal to the government, then practically no corruption cases can hurt the governmental side because they will not even appear on the table of the court. Sorry if it was a bit unclear, and again,
no, that makes sense.
I'm lacking a bit also the legal terminology because I'm not a legal scholar, and maybe
okay.
I
understand.
proved it rather right.
Somewhat sensitive. And is Hungary is not a federation, so you don't have state level, or canton or a province level prosecutors.
Yeah, Hungary is a country of 10 million, so it's like,
So the one prosecutor calls all the shots, and if they're loyal to the
one
government,
prosecutor calls all the shots, and it's a country that is really small and traditionally rather centralized. We have to tell it as well, but it had after the transition. So Hungary was transformed from a state socialist or communist country, a soft communist country, to a democratic country back to 1919, the big wave of democratization. And then a big wave of decentralization came as well, when schools, municipalities, counties, cities, student organizations have received way more power than they had before, and it was substantial power. But then the recognition in many countries was that, we over decentralized, then it practically kills the ability of the governmental decision making. And there was again a recentralization trend, but not everywhere it went as far as in Hungary. Right. In Hungary, for example, to tell you a few examples, the schools and elementary schools and the hospitals belonged to the municipalities, to the cities, and they ran them, and they did rather efficiently. Right now, the government runs the show there as well. The mosquitoes were killed by the cities and municipalities before. It's also done by the government, right? And I can tell you, living in a neighborhood where there are quite a lot of mosquitoes, that they are not always doing a perfect job.
And is that an Orban reform, those centralizations?
Some of them are Orban reforms. Some of them were particular reforms that were coming during the COVID era. So the COVID have led to even more centralization.
And do you think that was being used as a pretext, or was there a rational justification for that during COVID?
In some case, for temporary decisions, I think this kind of centralization was to a certain extent inevitable. But for some other reasons, they just used it as a pretext. Give you one example. They passed over a law that allows big Chinese investments in Hungary, this so-called Budapest-Belgrade railway line. And it was also made totally confidential. So it is built by state money by the end of the day, with partially Chinese constructors, but via Chinese loans. Serbia and Hungary are practically, I have to tell, both up by China by this big project. But it does not seem self-evident that it's so valuable for the Hungarian voters, and it was made confidential. And they made many governmental decisions that had suspicion of corruption confidential, just referring to the interest of the state in the pandemic period. So in Hungary, there is practically permanently some special legal status, or sorry, I just forgot this word. When it's easier for the government to make decisions and the rights of the parliament are partially suspended. So it's and there was these special legal statuses because of the migration situation, even when it appeared, then because of the pandemic, and it ran pretty high, and right now because of the war, and there seems to be a very strong willingness on the Hungarian government to keep up these special legal periods, because it just helps the government to do whatever they want with very minimal parliamentary control and with minimal public control as well. So I think that it was used as a pretext, and it's like, I mean, there are some similarities between Hungary and the US if we take a look at the political landscape, but I think there's a vast, huge difference. On the right in Hungary, there is no, how to say, anti-federalist sentiment at all, just the very opposite. So the Hungarian right is more ethicist, it's more statist, and in that respect, I think the Hungarian tradition, and it's particularly becomes so, is becoming more like the French one, with a very strong central government, and with a philosophy that a strong state is pretty much needed to push over the will of the people, if we want to be.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned France. I was thinking of France because I don't think that this is about Hungary's population of 10 million people. You can have big centralized countries like the United Kingdom is quite centralized, and France is quite centralized, and you can have small decentralized countries like Switzerland, where there is considerable local power. So I don't want us to think that we can escape Hungary's fate just because we're in larger countries necessarily. So in January, I saw reports that the European Union was debating whether to sanction Hungary further because of reforms that Orban brought in last year. Were those the judicial reforms, or what happened in the middle of last year that got the European Union upset?
It was partially about the judicial reforms. It was also about some other measures of the government, like this rearrangement of the university sector that, according to the critics of the government, have just increased the chance of the interference into the governmental affairs. Into the university affairs. And what we can see at the moment, to take a look at the big picture, is that, this kind of conflicts, legal and political conflicts between the European Union institutions, mostly the Commission and the Parliament, but also increasingly the Council, are just getting more and more intense. And in some sectors, and I don't want to paint the devil on the wall that Hungary will leave the European Union, but in some sectors, the leaving the European Union have practically started. If you take a look at the education sector, these model changing universities that went through an institutional reform because of which some active party politicians can also have their words, or ex-ministers can have an important influence at the boards of the universities. They refer to the American example, that if it's normal in America, why it cannot be normal in Hungary as well. I do think that in the United States, the universities enjoy much more freedom than in Hungary, but because of this debate, the European Union have suspended the so-called Horizon grants, which are pan-European grants that universities and academic institutions can apply to, and it's quite a lot of money. So these model-changing universities were excluded from that, and the students were excluded from the Erasmus programs, which means that they can practically travel freely around the European Union and have some educational experience. Hungarian students in Portugal or in Spain or in Malta or anywhere else. And, it was one of the most important and most obvious advantages of the EU membership for the youth. as a result of this decision, I don't think it was definitely a wise decision. And I think the European Union could have made some other decision that could circumvent the university, still allow students to go to other European countries. But because of that, the popularity of the European Union faltered quite significantly among the youngsters as well. So I think as a result of this unorthodox governmental policies or heterodox governmental policies, and also as a result of the European reactions, the Hungarian society that has been traditionally rather pro-European, also pro-American to a certain extent, is developing stronger and stronger anti-Western attitudes. And this is what I find rather dangerous and rather striking. Again, it's not something that you can only see in Hungary. If you go to Slovakia, for example, our neighbor to the north, in the public opinion polls, you can measure even stronger anti-Western sentiments. But this is a Slavic country where, this idea of Slavic brotherhood with Russia is this Eurasianist ideology is rather strong, not pan-Slavism, not at all in Hungary. So there is something new going on. And again, maybe it will be a very stretched parallel with the United States. But what we could see in the last years, for example, is that on the Fidesz camp, in the pro-governmental camp, Russia have become way more popular than it was before. United States have become much less popular. European Union have become much less popular. And I could see some polls, especially about 2016, that show that the Republican voter base in the US have also become a bit more pro-Russian, maybe as a reaction to that if Trump is attacked, that he's pro-Russian, that Russia must be something good.
It's possible. I mean, so what explains the Hungarian government's affinity for Russia then? Is it that people are responding to the government, or is the government responding to the people? Because Hungary has been holding up funding for Ukraine. Orban admires Putin in a way that is unseemly to a lot of other Western European and Central European countries. What explains that?
Thank you. And you just pointed to the most important part of the question. I do think that the people respond to governmental messaging and reactions. And because the voter base of Fidesz, the governmental party, was the most critical towards Russia until about 2010. You can see it in the polls. They were highly critical. In the Hungarian right, especially after, communism and 1956, the anti-Soviet, anti-Russian sentiments were central in the identity. So it was, and 1956, when there was a revolution against the Soviet rule, which was brutally cracked down by the Soviet Union, it was regarded to be one of the most important element of points of reference in Hungarian history that proves that, you have to be cautious with the Soviet Union, with communism, but also you have to be cautious with Russia. Russia also broke down another freedom fight of Hungary, and it was Tsarist Russia that joined the Habsburgs in 1849 to break down another revolution for national identity. And, Hungarians regard themselves, and especially on the right, as freedom fighters, fighting against oppressive forces. And it, in a very bizarre manner, after Orban returned to power in 2010, he gradually became more and more in favor of Putin, while he was very critical of Putin when he was in opposition before 2010. But I think there was a big leap when Orban undersigned the nuclear deal with Rosatom to build another nuclear reactors in Hungary. That was without any tendering procedure and so on in 2014. But from 2010, especially 2014, we can see that in the pro-governmental media, the depiction of Russia have become, very positive. There are Putin appears, more as this kind of sensible and rational world player, while everyone in the West goes mad, and everyone is warmonger in Europe. Also, the history has overwritten in many sense. Right now, the dominant narrative in the right is that it was not the Soviet Union that cracked down the 1956 revolution, but it was Ukraine, as if Ukraine was enjoyed any kind of independence.
That is bonkers. That is crazy.
Yes,
and it's so disrespectful to the heroes of that era when Hungary was, a light on the hill, and the whole world was behind Hungary and was admiring Hungarian resistance.
Exactly. You're absolutely right. And we arrived to a point that when the prime minister, I think it was last year or a year ago, posted something on Twitter about the revolution, he said that someone break down the revolution, and he did not mention the Soviets. Anti-Western sentiments had went so far in Hungary that it is also becoming a dominant narrative that communism, it was just a Western ideology because it was Marx and Engels, the German guys, who invented them, and then Lenin, as the spy of Germany and the agent of Germany, brought it to Russia, and Russia have become communism. Become a victim of this deadly, dangerous Western ideology.
Right.
And so, overwriting the history.
It's always our fault. Even when it's Soviet communism, It's still our fault.
And also, you did not defend us in 1956. You did not enter.
Sorry about that. We didn't want World War III. But
yes, I think that's the point. But it's also fueling the negative sentiments towards the West. So what I want to say is that Orban have developed this very strong anti-Western and in many sense, pro-Russian, pro-Chinese, pro-Azeri, so pro-Eastern mindset, and he is very clear about that. And he could change the attitudes of the voters in Hungary, especially on the right, but even more generally, at the beginning of the Russian invasion against Ukraine, majority of the Fidesz voters blamed Russia for pretty good reasons, given that they are the aggressors. When the 2022 election campaign approached, or when the election day approached, the government was pushing a very strong pro-peace narrative, quote unquote, and the message was that it's partially United States fault, is partially the Ukraine fault. Fault of Ukraine. As a result of this rhetoric, right now, majority of the Fidesz voters blame United States or Ukraine because of the war, and Russia is only third in the list of the responsible actors.
Extraordinary.
And
it's actually offensive to Vladimir Putin to strip him of that much autonomy. It's like it's insulting to the Russians to say that they're not in control of that war.
Yeah, you're right. But Putin does not seem to be offended. So this
he'll take it.
Orban was the only leader who met him in Beijing. He was not the only one who met Putin since the beginning of the invasion, but he was the only one who went to Beijing last year and had a very friendly discussion, not only with Xi Jinping, but also with Putin. And I think there is a good reason why Ukraine and most of the Western world are concerned by this pro-Russian shift. And don't forget that Hungary is the last country right now that is blocking the accession of a new member into NATO that would be in the interest of all the NATO member states. And this is Sweden, and they are doing it for very bizarre reasons, but it's hard not to see here as well that there is some kind of loyalty that Orban more exercises towards Russia than towards the Western alliances such as the EU and NATO.
So, Peter, if Orban is this semi-strongman who has shaken up the media and given it pro-government orders, and has stacked the judiciary, and has allowed corruption to go unchallenged, and has undermined independent institutions, why do you think he's so popular among a certain cohort of Western conservatives?
Yeah, there are many reasons for that, and let me pick up three. And it's first, I think we have to give credit to Orban in the sense that he is a highly efficient and highly successful political leader. He really he's in power for 14 years, and it has a price. Hungarian democratic institutions have weakened really drastically, and you can see it in all the democracy indicators all over the world, produced in, even it's the Economist Intelligence Unit or the World Bank, whoever does these democracy indices. We can see that there is a clear democratic decline, and it's not because there is a conspiracy against Hungary, but because it's pretty obvious and visible. But if you have some kind of illiberal mindset and you want to be on government for a long time, and politicians usually want to be on power for a long time, then you can take a look at this model. And for example, in these days, neighboring Austria has a party, the Austrian Freedom Party, which is a populist right party. They very openly talk about Orban as being their role model, and they want to implement something what Orban did, even in the media sector. This is what Heinz Christian Strache told before as well in a leaked videotape. But I think it's the mindset there. In France, in Italy, in, Slovakia, Czech Republic, there are politicians in the United States who think that Hungary has this important model. And I think partially it's because of the success first. Second, it's also because Orban is very conscious in spreading his soft power. And there is such a thing as Hungarian soft power. And I have to tell, it's quite remarkable because Orban can really have become, I would say he become this kind of shaman of the populist right in all over the world, which means that he cannot really substantially influence decision making when it comes to the EU, when it comes to the NATO, also when it comes to alliances with like-minded leaders like Giorgia Meloni as well, the Prime Minister of Italy, who is leading a post-fascist party practically, but she's remarkably moderate when it comes to economic policy and foreign policy. There is no friendship between them. But I think Orban is definitely a point of reference when it comes to, who are the people who are describing and characterizing this new zeitgeist. And despite the fact that Orban's predictions, I think in the last few years were rather bad, I have to tell. It's like, Orban, and he's not the only one. German, French, and so on decision makers all thought that Russia will never invade Ukraine. It did. Then they told that the war will be over in 8 years, in 8 days. Sorry, maybe it will be 8 years by then.
I think 8 years is closer. Yeah,
but it did not really work. He said that NATO will weaken, and it just the opposite have happened. He works hard on weakening NATO, but still it's a pretty strong alliance, and the list goes on. But he is regarded to be, this big visionary who knows what is going to unfold in the world. And there is some ideological word behind that. We have to be clear about that. I think to many extent the theoretical work that I think is mostly lacking these days on the liberal and left-wing side. I think they are doing quite a lot of intellectual work to improve, their arguments, but also to create these meta theories and meta political frameworks that can help to change the mindset of the attitudes. And for that, I think Hungarian soft power is pretty successful, and especially in the US, but not only there. How much it can be translated to bilateral relations, I'm a bit unclear about that, even in a possible oncoming Trump presidency, but let us discuss it later or in another discussion. And I think the third important reason why Orban could become so successful is that he very consciously following this kind of I think it's also a Trumpian media strategy that you have to be, even if you are depicted as the boogeyman, even if you are depicted as the negative hero, everyone talks about you. And everyone is talking about Orban these days, so do we. When leaders in the US, when leaders in Germany, when leaders in France are just mind-reading Orban, I just meet with many diplomats these days, who just want to figure out what's in Orban's mind, what's his strategy, what's his personality, and things like that. Orban is in the focus of attention, and he did it with quite conscious, provocative foreign policy strategy. And even if it did not really help to find more allies for him in the Western alliance, it clearly helped him to gain worldwide recognition.
In America and the UK and Australia, there's a cohort of conservatives, of social and cultural conservatives, who feel that the progressive gains of the past 20 years have been ruthless and have left them behind, that there is a new orthodoxy being imposed by Hollywood and media institutions that is forcing everyone to accept a new left-wing, progressive, identitarian, social justice worldview. And there is no space for religious conservatives anymore, and that the solution to this is to construct, I don't know what they envision, but some kind of more authoritarian brand.
To hear the rest of this conversation, go to uncomfortableconversations.substack.com/listen, and you will get your own personal premium podcast feed with at least 3 extra episodes of the podcast every month and heaps of extra stuff, including the remainder right now of the fabulous conversation you've just been hearing. If it was worth listening to this much of, don't rob yourself of the rest. Pull out your phone right now and search for Uncomfortable Conversations on Substack.